Hello, everyone. Welcome to the role of energy in global climate change mitigation and adaptation, celebrating the launch of environmental research energy. My name is Bethan Phillips, and I'm a publisher here at IOP Publishing. And I'd like to introduce today Dr. Emily Grubert, our Editor-in-Chief of Environmental Research Energy. Emily is an Associate Professor of Sustainable Energy Policy and concurrently of Civil and Environmental Engineering and Earth Sciences at the University of Notre Dame in the US of A. Her research focuses on justice-orientated deep decarbonization and decision support tools related to large infrastructure systems, especially energy. So welcome, Emily. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Bethan, and thank you for everybody who's here. We're really excited to have the opportunity to hold this virtual conference and for all of you to hear a little bit about our new journal. Bethan will take over after me and talk a little bit more specifically about the journal. But I think, as people may know, we've recently launched Environmental Research Energy and are really, really excited about the prospects of this journal. So I was going to spend the next few minutes that we have together talking a bit about this topic that we have, the role of energy in global climate change mitigation and adaptation, really with the goal of kind of setting the stage for why we see energy as so important, and also specifically why environmental research energy is what we're thinking about as kind of an energy transition aware journal that really tries to take the role of energy in these big processes seriously at a systems level. So with that, I will walk us through a little bit about energy's role, some of the things that we're interested in, and then hopefully spark a few conversations and some thinking about what kinds of work you might want to submit sometime. But I think one of the kind of fundamental points that I'm sure a lot of people are already reasonably familiar with is this notion that about 80% of global marketed energy is provided using fossil fuels. When I say marketed energy in this context, what I'm trying to kind of point out is that we do use a lot of solar just through like windows and things like that. So we heat and light our homes without necessarily using mechanical interventions or electricity. And it's useful, I think, sometimes not to forget those opportunities. But when we think about the kinds of energy that you buy and sell, so gasoline, electricity, those types of things, this value of about 80% fossil fuel based has actually been remarkably stable for a very long time. And so as we see growth in energy consumption for both development purposes, adaptation purposes, and a lot of other kinds of purposes that are really providing services to people around the world, energy use is useful and good and provides a lot of benefits, but it is dominated by fossil fuels in a way that really points us to the need for a fairly rapid transition associated with a huge amount of the infrastructure that we actually use already. So I think one of the main points that I want to make here is that one of the reasons why we are trying to be so transition aware and transition conscious as we think about research in the energy space going forward is because this is not a situation where we're trying to reduce emissions by 10 or 20%. This is a situation where we're really talking about overhauling the infrastructures and the systems that support a lot of these very life-critical services that are incredibly important to keep providing, but we need to do in some other way. I will also say this varies a little bit country by country, but is kind of surprisingly consistent around the world, and most transportation fuels in particular are oil-based. The other point that I think people are already probably quite familiar with is this notion that fossil fuel combustion is the main cause of climate change. When we look at the kinds of emissions that we're seeing, fossil fuels more generally, so not just the combustion, but things like methane emissions, et cetera, also are fairly large contributors. But when we think about climate change, it's not just fossil fuel systems, but that's the large portion of it. And so just thinking about what that actually looks like in practice, it means that our fossil-based energy system turns out to be the primary driver of climate changing emissions. So this is a figure from the IPCC's sixth assessment report, and basically just showing that the CO2 from fossil fuels and industry, which is mostly cement in this case, is that light blue on the bottom, accounting for about 64% of total greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. The other big fossil-driven piece of this is the red bars with that 18% from methane as well. And a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of that also comes from fossil fuel use. So when we think about, again, climate as kind of this massive, massive driver of why we might want to change our systems, and we think about energy as something that we need to continue to provide, and we need to really think about in terms of the services that we're providing using it, there's a really clear need to shift how we are doing that if we are to actually address climate change. This is kind of the mitigation part of the role of energy in global climate change mitigation. You cannot mitigate climate change without really seriously addressing how we create energy and our energy systems more broadly. Then to just kind of point this out too, I think something that a lot of people know but maybe haven't really thought about is the fact that emissions have continued to grow over time. And we talk a lot about some successes that we've had just in terms of massive, massive price declines with wind and solar and things like this. We have seen quite a bit of transition effort, especially in kind of longer term industrialized economies like the United States or Europe, in trying to decarbonize electricity in particular. But overall, emissions have actually continued to grow. So this is a very similar figure to the one that I showed in the last slide, but from the fifth assessment report. In this case, the gold is CO2 from fossil fuels and industrial processes, and the light blue is methane, going back to 1970. What I think is maybe the surprising piece is that when this is a little bit goofy because it's overlaid to try to match the same size as the other one. But when you actually add the 2010 to 2019 data that we got out of the sixth assessment report to the same figure, you get a record going back about 50 years and see that this has been a fairly steady upward climb. So not only are we in a situation where a transition is urgently needed, but we're in a situation where the transition has not been proceeding quickly enough. This is not a business as usual situation, either in the sense of kind of continuing to do what we've always done, using a lot of fossil fuels to provide our energy services, but it's also not a business as usual situation in terms of just allowing the transition that has already begun to continue. When we think about transition, we're really talking about something that needs to fairly dramatically accelerate and needs to change in character at a lot of different scales and within a lot of different social contexts. So a lot of the conversations that we have about mitigation always come back to this question of how do you do this with justice at its center? You're talking about switching over a huge amount of infrastructure basically everywhere in the world, while also simultaneously needing to be able to provide these critical services that allow people to be healthy and thrive and all those kinds of things. And really what that looks like is going to differ depending on where we are. And it's going to take a lot of research to try to understand how we can do this very, very quickly. I realize that talking about research is always also a little bit difficult in these contexts because it is something that needs to change very, very quickly. But this is part of the reason why I think we're very excited to be part of the IOP family with a very open access oriented focus and a very strong commitment to making sure that research is able to reach as many people as possible as quickly as possible, because this is something where we're really at the point of action already. When we think about climate change, one of the other things that I think becomes very important, especially in the context of the role of energy, is that we are already locked into a certain amount of climate change, but we also know that it's a cumulative effect. So we can actually change our future a bit depending on how quickly we're able to transition. This is another figure from the sixth assessment report coming out of the IPCC earlier this year, and basically suggests that there are a lot of different pathways that are still within the realm of a plausible future. And so in thinking about transition, this is also a situation where we really want to be understanding scenarios for what the energy system might look like and scenarios for how we can try to achieve these lower climate change outcomes, but also avoid the higher climate change outcomes. Also a figure from the IPCC, but I think this figure is one that has been very impactful for me, and I think a lot of other people as well, just kind of showing how soon a lot of this is happening. So one of the things that I remark on sometimes is that when we have all of these targets for things like, total net zero emissions by mid-century, I won't be of retirement age by then, which is a little bit wild to think about. But children born today are likely to still be alive in 2100. Like, we are within a couple of generations of a lot of these outcomes. And so we have a huge opportunity to actually enact change that is not only effective, but really is very conscious of what this means for people. So ensuring that these services are provided at the same time as we're being careful to reduce pollution. But we're in a very critical time, really, both from a climate change perspective and from an energy transition perspective, which is part of why we believe that this is such good timing for really trying to increase the amount of attention to this subject. So overall point, energy transition is crucial for mitigation. One of the things that is a little bit complicated also is that we're talking about transitioning a lot of existing infrastructure. So my next couple slides are going to take examples mostly from the United States because that's mostly where I work. But the overall point is we are starting from a huge amount of infrastructure that has lifespans and those kinds of things that actually do have implications for how quickly we can change, but also where we have major opportunities. So the image that's circulating right now is essentially a depiction of all of the fossil fuel fired electricity generators in the United States based on age. The red ones are natural gas plants, the black ones are coal plants, and the couple of green ones are oil-based plants. But what this is essentially showing is that you have a huge amount of infrastructure already that is basically the picture of what we need to retire over the next 25 years. In the US, we actually have a target of 2035 for decarbonization of the power sector. So hypothetically, in the next 12 years, this is what you would need to be retiring. At the same time, at least here and in a couple of other contexts where we have kind of long-term industrialization, a lot of this infrastructure is quite old. And so that provides us an opportunity to switch over with some initial planning in a way that might not be as disruptive as it initially seems. This is an advantage in the US because we have this older infrastructure. In places with newer infrastructure, some of these conversations are a bit more difficult. But I think taking this very infrastructure-based approach to thinking about what transition actually looks like really does open up some opportunities for us to realize that there may be some pathways that are easier than they look. We're not necessarily stranding a huge amount of infrastructure in the United States if we are moving away from fossil-based power, largely because much of it is old. Again, that doesn't apply everywhere, but I think when we start to take a very infrastructure-oriented view of energy transition, we can find some opportunities that might not be obvious without that analytical frame. One of the other areas beyond power that's incredibly important for the energy transition is transportation. And like I said earlier, in the world, most transportation at this point is powered by oil and petroleum products. So gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, marine bunker fuel, depending on what you're talking about, but very, very dependent on fossil fuel use directly. This is part of the reason why electrification is interesting. It's part of the reason why people are looking into hydrogen for heavy duty vehicles, those types of things. But similarly here, when we think about infrastructure, there are a huge number of directions to go and to consider when we think about transition. So not only what does it look like if you start to swap out fuels on an individual vehicle level, but what would it actually mean to provide mobility in a different way? And here again, really taking an infrastructure first view of what energy transitions might look like can kind of unlock a analytical space that might not be that obvious. There's a recent report that really focuses on the amount of lithium that might be needed under different mobility futures that I really like, by Theoria Francos and colleagues, that essentially concludes that if you invest in a mobility future that's very transit oriented and really considers a lot of options for mobility beyond individual personal vehicles, you can fairly dramatically reduce the amount of mining you need to support a new electrified future. There's a lot of different kinds of ways that we can think about transportation, and that kind of research is, I think, really important as we're getting into a space where many, many countries are really thinking about policy very quickly. But one of the other conclusions of that paper was essentially that we moved our mobility systems from not car-based to car-based pretty quickly, like over a generation or two. that's not necessarily something that we could never do again. And we do have a history of some of these transitions happening pretty quickly, even though they haven't necessarily been as intentionally directional as we're thinking about for climate change mitigation. But really identifying opportunities like that and thinking about what it would take to succeed, I think, is a huge, huge opportunity for research in a lot of ways. To kind of wrap out the kind of big three, the way that I think about it in terms of energy transition targets, this is an image that basically shows the different heating sources that are used in the United States for people's homes. In this case, the purple's kind of bluish color, and the red are fossil-based, and then the yellows are wood and electricity. But what we kind of see here, especially for those that aren't as familiar with the United States, the cold areas are the ones that are using fossil fuels directly for heating. And one of the reasons for that is that electricity has historically been pretty expensive to use for heating. To think about transitioning all of this infrastructure away, again, requires a pretty place-based approach. This is not necessarily going to be the same solution everywhere. Climate matters, existing context matters, rurality and urbanity matter, these kinds of things. But it's a huge opportunity to think about how we could do this better, but also a huge area where we do really need to understand some of the risks and benefits of specific interventions. So in particular, thinking about transitioning a lot of these fossil fuel-based places to something else immediately, we really need to make sure that those new systems work, because those are areas where winters can be deadly if you don't have heat. A lot of the more mild climate areas maybe have been a bit more willing to do some more experimentation, but really thinking about how we have backup systems, how we ensure that people have continuity of service, et cetera, during this transition is another thing that is solvable, but requires some research. And I think a lot of the promise of work that's really focused on the role of energy in climate change mitigation is that a lot of these questions are answerable, and we just haven't necessarily spent the time to answer them yet. But as we think about power, transportation, and heating as kind of these really big areas, not just in the United States, but globally, there's a huge number of questions about how we do this safely that accompany the really great work that's been done to date on how we do this at all. So I think we're getting into the point where we can be both socially and technologically aware in our research and really try to anticipate problems that might emerge so that we can prevent them from being serious. As we think about the role of energy in global climate change mitigation, I also want to just call attention to the co-benefits of some of these transitions. We're talking about climate change in many cases, but it's also the case that there are quite a few other pollution and other types of implications of using fossil fuels in many cases. So this map in particular shows where air toxics intersect with vulnerable communities particularly. And again, if you're not super familiar with the US's energy geography, a lot of the really serious pollution impacts occur near refining corridors and near a lot of other industrial activities, often in places with fairly poor and fairly racialized populations. And so when we think about environmental justice, energy justice, and a lot of other aspects of what it means to do this in a way that is really justice forward, thinking about some of the advantages that we get from retiring infrastructure and replacing it with something else is also kind of a key part of understanding the role of energy in climate mitigation. At the same time, trying to understand what those replacements look like in terms of additional harms, different harms, et cetera, is also pretty important here. And so thinking about what that transition looks like, how we can really take advantage of some of the potential benefits is a big area as well. But in general, when we think about climate change mitigation, it is becoming something that is hopefully more immediately obvious from a policy perspective that we actually need to act on. So big issues with wildfires. This is another American example, but really starting to see a lot of those impacts of climate change. Obviously, around the world, there are many people that have already experienced the worst impacts of climate change. And so really thinking about how we can urgently act to prevent more of them from happening, I think is another huge focus of research in this area. And then similarly, really thinking about where we have system vulnerabilities. This is an image associated with a pipeline freeze that happened in the United States a couple of years ago that almost knocked out an entire grid section. There are a lot of vulnerabilities with these systems that are not necessarily immediately climate impacted. So things like limited maintenance and not really ensuring that a lot of the systems that we have are able to provide the services that we need them to has resulted in quite a few pretty serious impacts over the years. Again, American example, but you can come up with these examples all over the world. But overall point being, there are a lot of opportunities to really think about how we create resilient and safer systems, even beyond some of the climate change impacts. So that's mitigation. I think our other point is just the major role of energy in adaptation to climate change. And this is something that I hope to see quite a lot of work on coming to the journal as well. But as we have talked about a little bit over the last few minutes, energy is a core part of mitigation just because it's such a big contributor to emissions. But at the same time, the reason that we use energy is to provide services, and a lot of those services are actually likely to be even more important for adaptation moving forward. So things like air conditioning in places that are extraordinarily hot. A lot of these things take energy. When we think about carbon dioxide removal or other negative emissions technologies, those are incredibly energy intensive. But really thinking about what it looks like to adapt to climate change and where we see a lot of new energy uses is something that is a huge area for research as well. Again, going back to an American example, when we think about reaching a net zero emissions energy system, what that probably looks like here is increasing the total size of the electricity system by up to maybe a factor of 6 or so. It's a huge amount of infrastructure. And so really in thinking about what adaptation looks like, we need to be aware of the fact that there's probably a lot more energy demand associated with specific types of things. In this case, a lot of this demand is really because of electrification of current fossil systems, but also related to some of the new types of energy demands we may see under climate change. So more cooling, CDR, those types of things. When we think about adaptation also, one of the really interesting areas of work, I think, is focused on buildings and how buildings can keep people safe during both hot times, cold times, other times, but really focusing on opportunities for comfort and safety within buildings via construction techniques that result in much lower energy consumption and these kinds of things. There are many opportunities for increased efficiency that can continue to provide services at the same time as there are a lot of opportunities where we expect greater need for energy as well. And just kind of making that point a little bit more strongly, this is a figure from a paper from a few years ago that essentially suggests that adapting building codes to be much more conscious of energy efficiency could create passive survivability in many more climates going forward, to the point where buildings could be much safer by mid-century if we are kind of aware of this as we build out our infrastructure. So thinking about the role of energy, not just in kind of the positive sense of providing a lot more of it, but also in the sense of really pursuing efficiency, and those types of things are all very much within scope and something that we hope to see a lot of work on as well. So overall point, and Bethan will talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but Environmental Research Energy is a transition-aware energy journal. We really hope to see quite a lot of work on the challenges associated with mitigation and adaptation, among other things, and are very focused on both kind of an overall energy systems view and this commitment to open access. So with that, we know that the energy transition presents this historic opportunity to remake our systems in a way that can be both more just and more sustainable, and we hope to see a lot of your research coming in. With that, I will hand it over to Bethan. Thank you all.
Fantastic talk. I will just talk for a little bit now, more specifically about the journal. So I'll just share my slides. Okay, great. Great. So yes, Environmental Research Energy is our brand new journal. So just to tell you a little bit more about it and about IOP Publishing. So IOP Publishing is a society-owned publisher with a head office in Bristol, but with staff based all over the world, with IOP offices and representatives in numerous locations. IOP Publishing is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Institute of Physics, and our net income goes directly to the IOP via gift aid to assist in their mission to help build their knowledge of physics and to provide professional support. And our authorship across our journals is extremely international, with China, USA, and India taking the top 3 places in 2022. So a little bit more about the IOP Publishing Environmental Journal family. We publish a number of environmentally focused journals, including environmental research letters, subject-specific journals such as Environmental Research Climate and Environmental Research Infrastructure and Sustainability. And now new for 2023, we have 2 brand new journals, Environmental Research Food Systems, and of course, Environmental Research Energy. So environmental research energy's aim is to bring together disciplines to address system-level energy challenges with an open access, society-owned publishing model dedicated to the dissemination of knowledge to the global energy research community. And it's headed up by our wonderful editor-in-chief, Emily Grubert. So the journals is multidisciplinary, open access, and it's devoted to addressing important challenges associated with energy in a way that bridges efforts relating to impact and future risk, resilience, and in particular, mitigation and adaptation, aiming to find solutions to these in the broadest sense. So as the energy sector transitions to zero carbon, addressing these climate issues while providing affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy to everyone will become a key challenge that really requires novel solutions. And so the journal is really hoping to provide a home for research scientists and economists, engineers, and social scientists who are working towards access to clean and affordable energy for all. So just to introduce you to our fantastic international editorial board who cover a diverse array of topics from across the journal scope. So here's just a snapshot of some of the people who are involved in the editorial board. And what makes environmental research energy unique? Well, here are just some of the great features of the journal. We offer a range of article types which are really aimed at serving and representing a broad audience, extending from academia to industry and government, with that aim to kind of really focus on the multidiscipline side of the journal. So that broad scope that brings together all of the different communities which are working towards providing affordable and reliable, sustainable and modern energy to everyone. IOP has several methods for promoting papers from our great kind of in-house team, including social media, press releases, emails, and podcasts. And finally, we're a society-owned journal, so we're again helping to support the Institute of Physics to further science research, education, and outreach around the world. As I mentioned, Environmental Research Energy is a fully open access journal. So as you probably know, the model of publishing that most journals have traditionally used is the subscription model, whereby publishers and societies fund a journal, and then these costs are supported by readers and readers' institutions who pay a subscription fee to access research and work. Environmental Research Energy uses a gold open access model, whereby the version of record is published online and is made freely available in perpetuity, usually under a Creative Commons copyright agreement. And then usually the article processing charge is paid for by the authors or via their funding model. But in this case, IOPP Publishing is currently covering all article publication charges. So the journal is free for both authors and readers to use. And there are several benefits to publishing open access, including increased exposure and impact within the community, growth in article downloads and citations. It expands scientific equality, so it really supports the principles of transparency and openness in scientific research, with the reproducibility of research facilitated by the availability of data code and research materials. The public can immediately access research, so it just makes it so much more accessible. And open access is also compliant with expanding open access grant rules and funder mandates. Another USP of IOP Publishing and Environmental Research Energy is our in-house team of staff of expert peer-reviewed staff members who manage the peer review process in conjunction with our editorial board. So our editorial office team make initial assessments and invite reviewers, occasionally asking the editorial board for further advice when needed. And so this has several benefits, including avoiding reviewer fatigue, avoiding conflicts of interest, and ensuring that we really have the best and most robust model of peer review. So moving on to that, we have a double anonymous peer review system whereby both the author and the referee are anonymous. So authors do have the option to waive this anonymity if they choose and remain under the single anonymous model. So we operate a double anonymous peer review on all of our journals at IOP, and this has the potential to help reduce bias with respect to gender, race, country of origin, and affiliation, and just focus on the scientific merit alone. We've really found that this model is preferred by early career researchers and researchers from China, India, and the Middle East. Results in a significant increase in female-first authored papers. We also offer the option for transparent peer review, whereby authors and reviewers, if they both opt in, then we will publish the review reports alongside the article, which helps to give more accountability and recognition to reviewers if they choose. Finally, if you are interested in reviewing for environmental research energy, please do consider volunteering to be a reviewer. We also have the option of co-reviewing, which allows two people to collaborate on a review report, both receiving recognition. So we offer this in the hope that early career researchers with more limited experience of peer review can work together with more experienced colleagues or supervisors to really help build up their peer review competency. And we also offer our peer review excellence training workshop, which is free and provides comprehensive peer review training, which is specifically tailored for the physical science. And this gives excellent reviewers credit for their hard work with the IOP Trusted Reviewer certification and allows reviewers to get feedback for their reports from editors. Coming back to what we're currently publishing in environmental research energy, here's just a selection of some of the open focus issues that we currently have in the journal, which is really highlighting the kind of works and topics that we're hoping to publish. So as you can see, we've got several open focus issues: the role of energy in global climate change, mitigation and adaptation, a focus on energy systems in the mid-transition, natural hazards, disasters and extreme events, which is a cross-journal focus issue across our entire environmental portfolio, focus on synergies between adaptation and mitigation for the energy transition, and focus on climate and energy modelling in net zero, intermediate targets and sectoral decarbonisation. And so that is it from me. So I'll stop sharing, and perhaps if we can bring Emily back on. There we go. We can answer any questions that we might have. So I can see that we have a question from Christina, which asks, could you please talk about the synergies in transitioning? I think that's one for you, Amy.
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. And as Bethan just pointed out, we actually do have an open focus issue on synergies in transition associated with adaptation and mitigation. So go check out that intro piece as well. I think there should be a page up that kind of describes what that focus issue is looking at. But just more broadly, I think there are a lot of synergies to be looking for as we think about transition. So one of the things about an energy transition for climate response essentially is that it's a normative thing, like kind of an end goal that is either achieved or not. So in this case, decarbonization, but a lot of the other things that come alongside that are the sources of these many synergies that we might think about. So some of them being things like reducing other co-pollutants associated with fossil fuel use. So a lot of the other kinds of air pollution and water pollution, sometimes solid waste issues that we see. But I think another one, and I'm a civil engineer, so this is kind of where this is coming from, but another really significant one is that it really does give us an opportunity to think about what we need our infrastructure to look like in this time where we kind of have to transition a lot of it. We have to build something new, but that's happening at the same time as we're starting to recognize that the future probably looks quite different from the past. I know one of the things that I think a lot about is that a lot of our engineering approaches to big infrastructure systems are based on an assumption of stationarity. So the future sort of generally looks like the past does, when that's not true anymore, particularly because of ongoing climate change. This opportunity to say we don't just need to kind of change the infrastructure that we have a little bit and try to make sure that it can work in these conditions that it wasn't designed for, but actually to say we do, because we need to remake our entire infrastructure system, we have this opportunity to think about what kinds of conditions those infrastructures need to be able to manage in the future. I think that's probably one of the most significant ones from my perspective, of just recognizing that we have this huge opportunity to rebuild a lot of things at a time where we understand what that future looks like a lot more. I think in existing heavily industrialized countries also, there's a bit of a tendency just in societies more generally to not do a ton of maintenance and things like that. And so really having this opportunity to, again, it's not something that we probably would have chosen to have to do, but because we do need to remake these infrastructures, doing it in a way that is likely to make them safer, better fit for purpose, and actually more adapted to a lot of the challenges that we face, while also renewing a lot of those infrastructures to ensure they keep functioning for a while, represents some really important synergies, I think.
And another question that we have is, you mentioned in your talk that we have experienced past transitions, going to a car-based kind of model. So are there any kind of lessons do you think that we can take from previous transitions, or any kind of, anything to avoid or anything to build in, I suppose?
Yeah, that's also a great one, and one that I hope we get a lot of opinions on in the research community too, because I think a lot of the time the general take is essentially that we haven't seen a super successful transition at this scale before. That is a little scary in some senses, because it means that we don't have a good model to be following necessarily, but it's also, I think, really helpful because we have seen a lot of things that work at the scales that they've been tried, and we see a lot of things that we know are not likely to be that successful. So one of the kind of major ones when we think about industrial transitions that I at least have paid quite a bit of attention to, and there are other examples like this, but in the 80s, the United States steel industry essentially collapsed for a variety of reasons. Not so much this normative sense of, we want to move to something else the same way that we're seeing with energy, but this collapse was relatively anticipatable. Like when exactly it happened was not, and how exactly it happened was not. But there was a general sense that this might happen. And the transition went poorly. I will start it that way. But one of the things that was very, very consistently kind of mentioned was that a lot of people felt that if there had been more centralized planning, more advanced notice of some of these closures, and more of a sense of what was going to happen next, that this would have gone much better. We have seen in a couple of smaller scale instances when those types of things have been tried. So kind of advanced notice of change, plan for what happens next, those kinds of things, the immediate community impacts tend to be quite a lot lower. I think one of the things that really stands out about the energy transition is that it is this global thing, but individual points of transition, at least in the sense of something being shut down or something being opened, do end up being quite local, and kind of consistent with a lot of what we know about industrialization and deindustrialization. So there's some really good work that's happened, like in the Ruhr Valley in Germany, thinking about what deindustrialization there has looked like, a couple of other examples around the world. But we do have a sense of things that we could have done differently that have been tried to some extent. And a lot of this does come down to advanced planning.
Brilliant, thank you. And I guess just one final question from me, but we're both we all know how important that, however the transition pans out, that it is a just transition. So how would you, do you have any suggestions for how we would actually measure that, and if there are any metrics that we could use to ensure that is a success?
Yeah, also a great question. I think this is one of those places where a lot of existing modeling work on energy stuff tends to be not that aware of distributional impacts. And that's something that more recent work has gotten better at. And I think it's really important to continue, at least in quantitative work, to be thinking very carefully about a lot of those distributional impacts and kind of checking for big disparities. There are a lot of ways to avoid this. I think when you're actually doing a project, the work looks a little bit different than when you're doing like a modeling piece or something along those lines. But one of the other things that I think is actually really important, and I hope that we see a good bit of it, is qualitative work in these areas and really trying to understand some of the underlying theoretical reasons why we do sometimes see these distributional negative impacts. The kind of rule of thumb, I think, in a lot of the research community is quantitative work can tell you how serious something is, but qualitative work tells you why it's happening. And I think particularly while we're still starting this in many ways, making sure that we have that work focused on why it's happening and therefore maybe how to change it is going to be really important.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think that is all that we have for today in this session. But thank you again, Emily, for your fantastic talk. And we will be back at 4:30 with energy and environmental justice. So that'll be another great session. But yeah, thank you again, Emily, and thank you to everybody who's come along to listen today. And
yeah, thank you, Bethan. Thank you, everyone.